The Vietnam War was the longest military battle in the history of the United States. It lasted from 1959 to April 30th, 1975. The Vietnam War was also referred to as the Second Indo-China War. It was fought between the Communist North Vietnam and the US-supported South Vietnam. Over 1.4 million military personnel and an estimated 2 million civilians were killed in the war. The war ended with the defeat of South Vietnam. Ultimately, Vietnam was unified and the United States was unsuccessful in their goal to bring down the Communist North. The United States sent 2.6 million troops into Vietnam during the war and suffered 58,000 deaths and 300,000 wounded. The war was heavily controversial on the home front, as so many Americans were not in support of the war. This was mainly because of the corrupt government the United States was supporting in South Vietnam. The war also involved 3 different presidents, all of whom claimed to have their own way to win the war. The United States has had a long history of the draft that dates back to the Civil War. During the Civil War, around 2% of the Union soldiers were selected in a draft. This conscription was proposed and passed under the Confederate President Jefferson Davis on March 28, 1862. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson's administration decided to rely primarily on the draft, rather than voluntary enlistment, to raise the military manpower for the war. Blacks were included in this draft on the same terms as whites for the first time. During World War II, we had our first peacetime draft, and during the war, 11 million men were inducted into military service. The draft was heavily relied on once again for the Vietnam War, as 38% of those who served in Vietnam were drafted. The average age of these draftees was around 19. Deferments were given out to those who were in college, had a civil occupation, or who had children at the time. You were exempt if you had already completed military duty, and disqualified if you had any physical or mental ailments that would impact your ability to serve. The draft was discontinued in 1973 and moved to an all-volunteer military force after that. For my interview, I chose to interview my grandpa, Wendell White. Wendell was born in 1937 in Grants Pass, Oregon, and is now 73 years old. He was raised by his grandparents, and he went to college at Walla Walla University. Currently, he is the president of Generations LLC, a senior housing company. I selected him because he was alive during World War II in Vietnam. He had received several deferments while at college during the beginning of the Vietnam War, and he was eventually drafted. The first 3 clips go over his support for the war, the draft, and in particular his deferments and how those worked.
Yeah, I understood what was going on and I supported. Uh, Probably I supported it more so then, just from a patriotic standpoint, probably more than I do now. Looking back at it, I question a lot of things, but at the time, you know, I was going to go fight for my country, and that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there was a draft all the time when I was a teenager, and when I went to college, I got a deferment to go to college, and then I got a second one and a third one. So it was pretty well sure that I was going to get drafted as soon as I got out of college. After your deferment is up, they gave us a 1 year deferment to go to college, and then I got a second one and a third one to finish my college education, and so that puts you at the top of the list.
I felt this was interesting because of how he supported the war while knowing all the facts behind it. This is in a time when so many people were openly against it. This next clip tells a story about the day he found out he was drafted.
Uh, your grandma and I got married that same day. I graduated in the morning. We got married in the afternoon. And after the wedding, well, my grandmother had the letter from my draft board that she gave me that said, "Your friends and neighbors have selected you to represent them in the service of your country and report to such and such and such and such." So that was a big day, a wedding, a college graduation, and getting drafted. When I went to Spokane, they put all of us draftees up in a hotel, and then next morning we went for our physical. There's probably 40 guys from all over uh, North Northern Oregon and Washington. Went into the physical, big line of guys with their shorts on, and that was all. And the doctor's checking you over and so forth. And my senior year in college, I dislocated my left knee playing football, and it gave me really a bad time, and had lots of fluid on it, and had several doctor visits, and so any kind of physical problem you were supposed to let the draft board know about, and uh, let the physicians who examined you know about. So I had a letter from my doctor explaining what had happened with my knee and so forth. So I went through all of the physical inspections, and one of the doctors said, "You sit over here." So I sat over there in nothing but my shorts for 1 hour, 2 hours, and everybody else is going through the process. 3 hours, and finally I got up and went to one of the doctors and said, "What am I supposed to do here? I've been sitting here all afternoon." And he looked at the medical records and said, "Oh, you got a mad knee. We don't want you. You can go home." That was it.
I thought this clip was interesting because it showed how much times have changed in medical records and history. Because nowadays, with everything done electronically, his knee injury would have showed up in the reports and most likely he would not have been drafted in the first place, let alone had a report for a physical.
Uh, like I told you, Betsy and I had gotten married, and we had planned our life. We had our car all packed, ready to make that trip to Texas where I was going to go into basic training. And I had, my senior year in college, I had known I was going to get drafted, so I was planning on the military. And then when I didn't, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a job. I was married, and really was kind of at loose ends. So I was very disappointed.
This clip shows how differently things were for young men during wartime. As he said, he based his life around the draft and going to war at that time. This is so different from today's point of view because most people straight out of college look immediately to get a job.
I really think that the military experience is a wonderful experience, and like I say, I was disappointed I never had that opportunity. And a lot of my friends who had that experience now are they got a lot of great memories about it. So uh, I would say to my grandsons to look forward to it, go out, enjoy it.
My grandpa planned on being in the military, and he was rejected, while others in the draft who hoped to avoid service had to go. The realities of having a draft is that service is not celebrated, but protested, as it was in the 60s and 70s. The United States has now come to the conclusion that a non-conscriptive military force is more efficient than the one that existed during the Vietnam War. The benefit to voluntary service is the military doesn't have to worry about the popularity of the war, which is what the government had to deal with in Vietnam. As a result, service is voluntary and those who don't want to fight are not forced to.